Kanye walks into philosophy class and destroys the professor with one simple question. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet university lecture hall, surrounded by students scribbling notes on Plato and Descartes, when suddenly the door opens and in walks Kanye West, not with cameras or an entourage, but with a notebook and a single question that changes everything. What begins as an ordinary philosophy class turns into an intellectual earthquake. This is the story of how a world-famous artist shattered academic norms with nothing but curiosity and courage. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more thought-provoking stories, and let us know in the comments, what's one question that haunted you? The unexpected student. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at the University of Chicago, where Philosophy 201, an advanced class on epistemology and metaphysics, was held in a grand, echoing lecture hall. Professor Hammond, a well-respected scholar known for his Socratic precision, stood before a sea of students eager to dissect the nature of truth, knowledge, and the human experience. The class was deep into a discussion on Plato's allegory of the cave when a heavy oak door creaked open, drawing everyone's attention. What happened next would ripple through academia and the internet alike. Kanye West stepped into the room, dressed in a simple hoodie, sunglasses, and a look of quiet determination. The classroom fell silent. Confusion painted across every face. The professor, momentarily stunned, managed a polite but puzzled smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, expecting perhaps a mistaken location. But Kanye nodded slightly and took an empty seat near the back without a word. Whispers erupted. Phones subtly rose to take photos. Was this a publicity stunt? A prank? But Kanye sat calmly, opening a notebook as if he'd been enrolled all semester. The air shifted. Something about his demeanor silenced the snickers and skeptical glances. When the professor continued his lecture, cautiously resuming the thread on the concept of objective truth, Kanye leaned forward, his pen scratching paper with uncharacteristic focus. Students, still processing his presence, tried to pay attention, but all eyes kept drifting back to him. Then came the moment. As Professor Hammond posed a complex question to class, can truth exist independently of perception? Kanye raised his hand. A chuckle escaped from the front row, but the professor, perhaps out of curiosity or challenge, nodded. Kanye stood, his voice steady and low. If truth exists without perception, then why do we argue over it? The room froze. It wasn't the kind of question that sought approval. It dismantled the foundation of the discussion entirely. Suddenly, what was supposed to be another routine class turned into a battleground of ideas. Before we continue, take a second to like this video, drop a comment on what truth means to you, and subscribe if you're curious about how this all unfolds. The ripple in the room. Professor Hammond paused, caught off guard not by the celebrity status of his new student, but by the gravity of the question itself. It wasn't philosophical jargon or rhetorical flourish. It was raw, pointed, and disarmingly simple. The students turned from their textbooks and notes to stare at Kanye, as if seeing him for the first time not as a global icon, but as a genuine participant in the world of ideas. For a brief second, the room felt like a fault line had opened beneath them. Hammond, to his credit, didn't deflect. He raised an eyebrow, placed his chalk back on the ledge, and asked, "Would you care to elaborate?" Kanye did. "We fight over truth because we don't share perception. So maybe truth isn't out there, it's in here," he said, tapping his temple. The conversation had shifted from abstract to urgent. What followed was something no student expected. Instead of brushing it off, Professor Hammond invited Kanye to the front of class. Together, they stood side by side, one an academic titan, the other a cultural provocateur, trading ideas about subjective reality, the limitations of language, and the way narratives shape belief. Students chimed in, some in support, others in polite disagreement. It wasn't chaos. It was revelation. One student compared Kanye's approach to Heidegger's. Another brought up Foucault's ideas of power and knowledge. The class, which had once been guided by a narrow syllabus, now flowed freely like an open forum. And in this space, Kanye wasn't a guest. He was a catalyst. As the hour passed, something else became clear. This wasn't just about Kanye challenging a professor. It was about challenging a system, about what we consider valuable knowledge, who gets to ask questions, and why education often alienates voices that don't speak its coded language. A philosophy class had turned into a reckoning. Kanye wasn't there to perform. He was there to break walls. If this moment got you thinking, hit the like button. What's one question you've always wanted to ask in a classroom but never did? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The friction of worlds outside the classroom. Words spread like wildfire. Tweets, TikToks, and blurry photos of Kanye at the lectern flooded social media, sparking debate across platforms. Was it a stunt? Was it genius? In the academic halls of the university, professors gathered over coffee with furrowed brows, some intrigued, others outraged. What authority does a rapper have to question epistemology? One asked, while another replied, maybe that's a very question philosophy needs. Within the walls of that lecture hall, however, the mood was different. The students returned the next day with a kind of electric energy. Books marked, questions prepared, not for professor, but for Kanye. And he returned too, notebook in hand, ready to continue the dialogue he'd ignited. But with this return came resistance. A few senior faculty members challenged Professor Hammond's decision to give Kanye a platform. This undermines academic rigor, they argued, yet Hammond defended it. Rigor is not about who speaks, but how deeply we're willing to listen. Still, tensions rose. Some students felt the class had become less about structured philosophy and more about Kanye's worldview. A few dropped out. Others joined in from outside departments, sneaking into the lecture just to witness the intellectual clash. Kanye was no longer just a participant. He had become a polarizing force, drawing lines between traditional academia and disruptive thought. And in that collision, a new form of learning was being born. Kanye, for his part, was aware of the tension. He addressed it head-on in one class. "I'm not here to be right," he said. "I'm here to be real." He began weaving stories from his life, his battles with fame, the weight of public perception, the silence that followed his most controversial moments, into the philosophical frameworks they were studying. It was no longer debate over abstract truth. It was a discussion grounded in lived experience. Students began to see how theory met reality in ways the textbooks never captured. And in that space, raw and uncertain, something sacred emerged. If you're feeling the power of these collisions between art and academia, ego and humility, smash that like button and share this video with someone who still believes classrooms should be silent. The mirror of the mind as the sessions continued. Kanye proposed a radical idea. What the point of philosophy wasn't to find answers, but to embrace the questions that unsettled us. The classroom transformed into a space of reflection rather than resolution. Students began bringing in personal experiences. Philosophical texts took on new meaning. And even Professor Hammond admitted he was rethinking his own long-held assumptions. One student, usually silent in the back row, shared how Kanye's presence gave him permission to speak. Because if someone like Kanye could question centuries of doctrine, maybe his voice mattered too. It was no longer about hierarchy. It was about honesty. The ivory tower had cracks in it, and light was streaming through. Kanye's most impactful moment came when the class discussed Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am." He leaned forward and asked, "But what if I feel, therefore I am?" The room went still. That subtle shift, from cognition to emotion, sparked a flood of interpretations. Students spoke of how society often dismisses feeling as inferior to thought, yet every major decision in life is driven by emotion. Love, grief, anger, hope, all motivators of human action, yet rarely given weight in philosophical discourse. Kanye wasn't dismantling philosophy. He was expanding it. He wasn't destroying Professor with a question. He was inviting him to rebuild a broader truth. Professor Hammond, once the master of the space, now shared it willingly. He stopped lecturing and started listening more. The class read philosophy not as fixed dogma, but as a living dialogue. Even critics who had once opposed Kanye's presence began to take notice. An article published in the university journal titled, "When the Artist Becomes a Philosopher," sparked international attention. Kanye had become something unexpected. Not just a disruptor, but a mirror. He reflected back the rigidity of academic thinking and offered something messier, more vulnerable and more real. If you've ever felt your thoughts weren't academic enough to matter, this is your sign to speak up. Like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting to the good part. A question that broke the room on what seemed like just another afternoon. The classroom reached its breaking point. The topic that day was moral relativism, whether right and wrong could be universal or if they were dictated by culture and context. The discussion was rich, layered with references to Kant, Nietzsche, and contemporary ethicists. Professor Hammond posed a hypothetical. If a society believes oppression is just, are they wrong or just different? Students began dissecting the question with careful academic detachment. Then Kanye, quiet for most of class, slowly raised his hand. All eyes turned. Why do we study right and wrong as if we're not living it? He asked. Why do we pretend philosophy isn't happening right now, in the streets, in the news, in every choice we ignore? The silence that followed was heavier than any debate that had come before. Kanye continued, not in anger, but in deep, measured conviction. I see philosophers debate evil like it's theoretical, but I've seen evil, felt it, been called it. His words weren't meant to indict the room, but to awaken it. He spoke about systemic racism, media manipulation, personal betrayals, all filtered through a lens of existential questioning. When do we stop talking about morality and start living it? He asked. His voice didn't waver, but his eyes held a depth that made it clear. This wasn't about philosophy. This was about humanity. The professor, visibly moved, set down his notes. The class wasn't sure whether to applaud, respond, or just sit with the weight of what had been said. In the end, they did all three. That question, simple, unpolished, and deeply felt, ripped open the safe cocoon of academia. Students went home that night, not just thinking differently, but feeling differently. The class group chat exploded with messages. One student wrote, "I'm rethinking everything I thought I knew." Another simply posted, "That broke me in the best way." It was no longer about Kanye versus the professor. It was about all of them, standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into the abyss of truth, and choosing to jump. And in that fall, they weren't afraid. They were awake. Comment below with a moment that ever shook your worldview. Don't forget to hit like. And if this story is giving you chills, you have to subscribe. We're about to go even deeper. The shift in the scholar in the weeks that followed, a subtle transformation unfolded. Not in Kanye, but in Professor Hammond. Once the unquestioned authority at the front of the room, he began to redefine what it meant to be a teacher. He no longer led the class in linear lectures. Instead, he facilitated conversations, asking more than answering. His wardrobe changed too. His usual blazer replaced by a simple sweater, as if shedding the academic armor he once wore. During one class, he stood beside Kanye and admitted, "I used to think truth was something you defended. Now, I think maybe it's something you seek together." The humility in his tone struck the students deeper than any textbook could. The teacher had become the student, and in that reversal, something profoundly human emerged. Hammond began referencing Kanye's questions during lectures, not as interruptions, but as catalysts. He brought in texts from outside the canon, James Baldwin bell hooks, even song lyrics. The line between high theory and popular culture blurred, and suddenly philosophy wasn't locked in a dusty room. It was everywhere. Students felt it in their relationships, their fears, their late-night walks alone. Philosophy had leapt off the page and into their bloodstream. Kanye, sensing this shift, took a step back. He stopped speaking as often, letting others rise. His presence had never been about dominating the space. It was about opening it. And now that it was open, he watched the growth unfold like a proud but silent witness. The media caught wind of this academic revolution. Interviews were requested, think pieces written, and even late-night hosts joked about Professor Yeezy. But inside the classroom, far from the noise, the essence remained purer. A professor who once measured his worth by citations now found value in questions he couldn't answer. A room once filled with quiet obedience now buzzed with fearless curiosity. Kanye's original question, "Why do we argue over truth?" wasn't just a disruption. It had become a doorway. And those who walked through it emerged changed. If you've ever had a mentor who grew with you, drop a comment below. Like this video if you believe learning is a two-way street. And don't forget to subscribe. We're getting closer to the final revelation. Truth. Reimagine as the semester neared its end. The course no longer resembled what it once was. The syllabus, once rigid and chronological, had morphed into a living organism, responsive, evolving, unpredictable. Students created projects that blended philosophy with music, dance, spoken word, and visual art. One group even staged a multimedia installation titled Perception is the Prison, where each visitor experienced a different version of truth based on sensory inputs. Kanye walked through it silently, later saying, "That was more real than most albums I've made." The final paper assignment was replaced with a personal manifesto. Students had to write what they believed truth was. No citations, no footnotes, just raw, honest thought. And what came out was nothing short of revolutionary. One student, in her manifesto, wrote, "Truth isn't a lighthouse. It's a match in your hand. You either light it or stay in the dark." Another compared truth to jazz, improvised, fleeting, but deeply real in the moment. Even students who had never spoken much during the semester found their voices, empowered by the freedom to think without the fear of being wrong. Professor Hammond collected the manifestos and cried after reading them, not because they were flawless, but because they were alive. Kanye's impact had transcended a single question. It had changed how young minds engage with the world. In his disruption, he had left behind a method. Listen deeply, ask fearlessly, and speak like your life depends on it. In the final class, Kanye stood at the front one last time. He didn't give a speech. Instead, he asked a new question. What do you think your purpose is in this world? Silence. Then, one by one, hands rose. The conversation lasted hours. It didn't follow logic. It followed humanity. It didn't seek conclusions. It sought connection. And when it ended, no one wanted to leave. Even Hammond lingered by the door, thanking each student personally. "You taught me more than I taught you," he said to Kanye, who nodded and replied simply, "That's the point. If this story has stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Comment your truth and hit subscribe. We've reached the final moment, but the journey doesn't end here." The legacy of a question months after the course ended, the echoes of what happened in that classroom continued to resonate. Other universities began reevaluating their philosophy programs, inspired by what became known informally as the Kanye Seminar. Educational forums buzzed with debates. Should academia embrace non-traditional thinkers? Can philosophy exist outside its ancient texts? But for the students who were there, the impact wasn't in articles or headlines. It was in how they saw the world now. One went on to launch a podcast blending philosophy and hip-hop. Another started a nonprofit focused on teaching critical thinking in underserved schools. Even those who pursued careers outside academia carried something with them: a refusal to accept easy answers and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. Kanye himself never returned to that classroom. He didn't need to. His presence had served its purpose. In interviews, when asked about the experience, he never gave the same response twice. Sometimes he'd say, "It was just a class." Other times, it was a reminder that truth doesn't care about credentials. But no matter the words, the message was the same. The question matters more than the answer. That simple line. If truth exists without perception, then why do we argue over it? Became a mantra for those who had heard it, not because it resolved anything, but because it refused to. And in that refusal, it invited everyone into the search. And now, dear viewer, the question is yours too. What does truth mean to you? Is it something external to be found or internal to be felt? If this story sparked a thought, a challenge, or even a small flame inside you, don't let it die out. Share this video with someone who dares to think differently. Leave a comment with the one question you've always been afraid to ask. Hit like if you believe that philosophy belongs to everyone, not just those with degrees. And subscribe, because this is only one chapter in a much bigger journey of ideas, voices, and truths yet to be uncovered. Kanye walked into a philosophy class and asked a question, but it's you who must decide what happens next.